welcome to TUM Think Tank. Welcome to everyone here in the room, but also to everyone following us online. I will start with an agenda because I have some organizational items that I want to inform you. Then I will do a quick intro to the TUM Think Tank, and then we will move on with our agenda, which I will explain shortly. First, organizational information. We are streaming the first part of the event today, so you in this room all will be recorded through these cameras until around 2:30 after the keynote of Sabina Leonelli. So this is just the first information for you all, that you are aware that this is happening. Then I just present you quickly the agenda and solve the mystery with the colored buttons on your name tags. So we will, after a short intro to the TUM Think Tank, we will have a welcome from the Ethical Data Initiative. Today, the kickoff of our initiative, which will be hosted here at the TUM Think Tank, and we are super happy that our new colleagues and friends are here today. And after weeks and months of online meetings, finally we are here together in person. This is super nice. After the welcome, we have the keynote of Sabina, why ethical data in the age of XAI. Very much looking forward to hear your thoughts and insights on that. And then we will go into a coffee break, and our guests online will then, for those, the event will end. Then we will have mini workshops, and there we have a color code, because we thought, okay, how we get without too complex system all of you into 3 different workshop formats. So we color coded everyone. So the red dots will be with Stefan. Starting with Stefan, because we have a rotatory system in place. So starting with Stefan at the back in the last room here, all green marked people will go with Suchit. Where is he? There. Follow him. You will stay in this room, so it's not a far way to follow him. You just are here. And then we have Kate. Where's Kate? Here in the back. You will be on the bridge. You will start on the bridge, because after 30 minutes we will rotate. So red marked people go to Suchit, green to Kate, and yellow marked to Stefan. After another 30 minutes, you will again rotate. So this way, everyone can discuss every topic. So this was the goal. So we coded you with colors, not by your expertise, because you can give your expertise in every of the 3 sessions. Then again, we will have a short coffee break. After that, it's not working, but my colleagues help me out. Thank you. We will have, next slide, please. A feedback and key insights from the mini workshops. We have rapporteurs in the sessions. They will be selected in the session by the session leaders. Then Sabina and I will do a short session on forming research alliances. So just collecting your feedback, your ideas, collaborating on research projects or publications, networking opportunities, or working together in teaching, training, and active projects like that. And after the wrap up, everyone that is here in Munich will then be invited to an evening reception here at our TUM Think Tank venue at our rooms, and we will have a fun night after that. Yeah. So now I will switch to the other presentation. Well, my colleague Rahel does. So just a few slides on the think tank. I will not do a half-an-hour presentation, I hope. So just I will start with my colleagues. So we will have our managing director in the back, Marcus, for everyone who's here in the room, but I think also I hope the online people can see her back there. Then we have my colleague Rahel. She's responsible for science communication at the think tank. Our newest member, Nas, sitting here, supporting us in project management and related activities. And I'm Philip, doing innovation management at the think tank. So just a few words on North Star. So what we have in mind for this year, on the one hand, we want to focus on technology for the public interest. So how can we make society better with emerging technologies? On the other hand, human-centered development of technology. So how can we build these emerging technologies human-centered with a benefit for society, responsible, human-centered, and democratic? Here, this slide I like very much because it shows the growth of our nice TUM Think Tank. So last year we had 6 labs and programs. And what does this mean, having labs and programs? So we are a management unit, the people I just introduced to you, Marcus, Nas, Rahel, and myself, and our student workers, which support us very much. We're a management unit supporting research and innovation labs working on different fields, following together with us our North Star. So this is the idea. Last year, Reboot Social Media Lab, a lab on mobility. I will not read them now for you, but so we started with 6 labs last year. Think Tank was funded 2 years ago in 2022. This year we have 11 labs and programs. So we are growing exponentially. We have a lot of new colleagues, of a lot of new researchers and innovators with us. One of our new initiatives, the Ethical Data Initiative with Sabina and her colleagues, that we will kick off today. So this is what we do. Our team supports these initiatives, labs in various ways, and we incubate them here at the Think Tank. And this is what I'm looking forward this year, create synergies between these labs, because we have just in the Immersive Realities Working Group 25 PhDs and postdocs, which I think from different schools and different chairs and from external partners. So we also include external partners, companies, NGOs and initiatives, and bringing them all together here. And so our work centers around 5 activity areas. So the first one I would call engaging communities of practice. So this is, we bring practical people from outside the university here to the TUM Think Tank, relating to the real world, to the people out there, real needs, real societal issues that we are facing here. For example, a community of practice on healthy online discourse is built up here since over a year, and this is what we are doing with community building. Of course, we also want to, it's a technical university, we also want to build prototypes, not only technical prototypes, also societal, social concept prototypes to improve our society, to contribute. For example, our InstaClone project, which was part of the Reboot Social Media Lab, built a tool called InstaClone as the project itself, and is a tool for teaching digital literacy. So this is things that we are doing, supporting then again as a management team, the development of projects, the results from our labs, and then the connection to our communities of practice. So this is coming together there. Then another important field for us, strengthening science and policy interface. So we are engaging with policymakers, being here at the Munich School for policy and public politics and public policy. So this is one really important part of our work, to engage with policymakers, improving the public sector and building capacity there, for example, with our AI roadshow. Having an impact on society, I already mentioned that. So we are also going, not just inviting, we are going out there. We are visiting festivals. For example, we brought our generative AI task force to the Festival of Future. And this is not a stock picture. This is a real picture that we from our work. So this is what we are doing. And here explaining generative AI to these young people that you can see here. And last but not least, our students at TUM. So we have over 50,000 highly qualified, excellent students at TUM, one of our strengths. And we want to support them as the next generation of public entrepreneurs, support them to improve our society, also with the technological background. One example, our young quantum social scientists, 7 young students that are working our quantum social lab on the interplay of societal challenges and quantum technologies. Yeah, and I'm coming to an end. Just a few numbers from last year. With over 100 scientists, we collaborated in our labs and programs over in TUM, and over 5 schools and campus that we have at TUM. So this is a cross horizontal through our TUM schools and chairs and research institutes. And outside of TUM, we did more than 130 events, just the 3-4 people that I mentioned. It's something that we do 130 events, and we had more than 30 collaborations with partners from civil society, businesses, startups, and the public sector. Yeah, so this is us, our contact. And now I give the floor to Kate, welcoming you in the name of the EDI. Or Suchit, start, sorry.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you, everyone. I just want to welcome you all to this meeting, and I want to thank first the TUM Think Tank, Philip, Marcus, Rafael, and all colleagues who made this possible. And what I'm going to do today is to give you an overview of what is the Ethical Data Initiative on behalf of the whole EDI team, Sabina, Kate, Stefan, and everybody who has contributed for this. And what I really hope is, we want to co-develop this initiative with all of you, and that's why it's really good to have all of you here. And we will introduce you to this. I will introduce you to this initiative, and then share how some of the key areas where we would like you to help us in our co-creation as well. So our aim is to create a global hub for data ethics and related education and policy activities. And I should mention, the 2 universities who have come forward and supported us, the University of Exeter and the Technical University of Munich. And, so the idea is to have these 2 universities as our global hub when we start developing this initiative. So the next slide, please. So the background of this is the whole concept of datafication that I'm sure all of you are aware of, and are aware of, and of the societal implications of this. And the more and more, our everything we do is there has a digital component to it, and there are a lot of ethical dimensions to it as well. So if you move to the next slide, please. So what we are particularly interested is in looking into, especially with the rise of these big data platforms, what are the key kind of ethical questions that come based on that. And there are obviously issues around privacy, but there are some big questions as well. Some of the ethical questions on how do we protect human rights, and how do we protect against bias and discrimination, and some of the power structures as well. Who owns the data, especially when you think about some of these big tech, or who are owning some of these data. So there are so many of these key research questions or ethical questions as well that we hope you will be able to, especially when we move into these discussion groups. We really hope you will start thinking about some of these kind of aspects in those discussions as well. So moving on to the next slide, and I just wanted to give one example. And when we talk about datafication, sometimes we think about especially from the developed world, because if you look at even look at some of the in each home in most of the developing countries, there are so many, there are so much like IoT devices and so much datafication happening. But on the other end, if you look at the global south, also this is the impact is in a different way. So I myself and Kate wrote an article around 2 years back. Specifically, that time we were working in the agriculture space, and one of the things that we were looking into at that time was the policy aspects of open data, specifically on the impact on smallholder farmers. And the key thing that I was specifically interested in the impact of smallholder farmers was, I was in a lot of these big meetings, but there was not a voice of the smallholder farmers represented in many of these big forums. And so I was very keen to ensure that how do we start raising awareness of some of these issues as well. And this there was an organization called GPSST, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and they requested us to write a short article, especially tailored to policymakers on how, because policymakers at that time, to get them ideas on, how these are impacting some of the most poorest people in the planet. And the link is there. We will share the slides as well. But the whole idea was again looking into the power structures. We have all these data collected from some of these are even illiterate farmers, and then but it all has an implications, from later for even getting access to credit and all these things. So so we wanted to empower, especially like farmer cooperatives, through capacity development, and in fact we were also working to develop one of the first code of conduct in agriculture data. So that was how we were trying to build mostly first awareness, and then bringing together like-minded colleagues to work on some of these big issues as well. So moving to the next slide. And there are a lot of initiatives, when I look back even just 5 years back, and now, we can see so many initiatives that have come up in this, and some of them are very specific for different domains. They are very sector specific. So, and for example, there is colleagues who are working in the geospatial data, location data. There is a really interesting initiative called Locust Charter. So they are, they bring up the domain experts who are working in that area. And just today morning we had International Science Council's working group, data ethics working group, that Francis was, Francis and Luis was there in that meeting. So this is all a lot of different active work happening in different areas, and some are very specific region-wise as well. Some are working specifically in a country or a region, but we can see a lot of activities happening by practitioners around the world. So I just wanted to share some examples of what are the kind of initiatives. And moving to the next slide, and what we hope. But one of the things we realized was, there was, even though it was very important to have specific domain-specific work, but it's also important to have a neutral platform to bring together with a global kind of perspective to start discussing these kind of issues. So it is just around 1.5 years back, we started thinking about this, and specifically to put in place a neutral platform to discuss key issues on this topic of data ethics and governance, with 3 key aims. One was to increase equity, and second was to advocate for inclusivity, and third is to, it's kind of like education aspect, is to build data confidence and empower digital citizens. So these were the kind of 3 aims that we want, primary aims of the initiative. And how do we do that? We want to bring together stakeholders from all areas and all different disciplines to make this happen. So the next slide, please. So, and that was how the Ethical Data Initiative was born, and and we believe that this is a collaborative endeavor, and that's why we wanted to have this meeting here and get all of you to share your ideas, and we co-develop this with all of you. And as I mentioned, the 2 universities, University of Exeter and Technical University of Munich, are the base of our global hub, and the TUM Think Tank and colleagues, they have been very instrumental in helping bring all these things together. And what we hope is, we have this global hub, but we want to set up these regional hubs as well, because we believe that it has to have like local dimensions as well, and then we want to bring partners from different areas to help us move things forward as well. So, and the way we want to do that is, obviously research is underlying everything. We want to ensure that all the work that we are doing is research-based and evidence-based, and we see 3 kind of pillars on which we want to build up this. One is specifically on policy and networks, and how do we build, bring key diverse stakeholders and shape the future of data governance, and that's why the policy and networks is one of the key pillars. And the second one is on education, and this one specifically, we are already working with universities, but we want to use this the key aim to enhance training in ethical data science and ethical AI across the globe. And this again, we hope to get all of your inputs in this area as well. And the final one is the engagement one, where we want to foster equity and responsibility in data practices. So when we go break out into these groups, what we hope is every one of you will be able to input in all of the 3 kind of aspects. So that is the way we hope we can collate all this. And basically, there's so much wisdom in this room, and we want to make sure we make use of this when we co-develop this for the future as well. Thank you. And I just want to introduce, obviously Sabina is going to do the keynote, so she's our PI for this, and Kate behind, so Kate, she's going to come and talk on more of what we are doing. And Stefan, Stefan is our head of research in Exeter University, and we will have a similar role in Munich as well. So I will stop here and I will ask my colleague Kate to take it from here. Thank you.
I picked up the wrong one. Hello. Hi. So as part of Thank you. Okay, thank you. As part of this collaborative venture between the two universities, Technical University of Munich and the University of Exeter, we will be building on work that's already going on within the two institutions. And Philip did a wonderful job presenting what was going on within TUM and the think tank. And I'd like to invite Sabina really briefly to talk about the work going on in Exeter University in this space. Thank you, Sabina.
Hello all, I'll greet you better later on, but just briefly for now, the work that's been going on at the University of Exeter has now been going on for probably around 15 years. Is a collaboration between the Center for the Study of the Life Sciences, so very much coming from engagement with researchers working in biology, biomedicine to start with, and then increasingly data science, engineering, and computer science, and the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, which we have at Exeter since a number of years. Very active group, doing a number of things. We have weekly meetings and a very engaged community there, which has been growing. So this is really where this is coming from in terms of where Exeter is concerned.
Excellent, thank you very much. So as we've already heard, inclusion, equity and social justice are core to the values of both the Technical University of Munich, the TUM Think Tank and the University of Exeter, and are also central to the mission of the Ethical Data Initiative. And we intend to achieve this by creating a neutral platform into which we can bring different varied stakeholders in order to talk about the key issues around data ethics and related governance issues. Thank you. So I'd like to just talk about some work that we've been doing on the effectively outreach side. And we have been working with the Association of African Universities, which is an organization that has over 450 member universities across the African continent. And we have been looking together at ways to increase the voice of Africa and African institutions in the discussions around AI and data ethics. We started with them, we co-produced the Ethical Data Discussion Series, which aired on their AAU TV channel, which, if I am right, goes out to about 12 countries across Africa, but also has online platforms as well. And we covered subjects such as data ethics policy in higher education, human rights in the platform economy, and the ethics of AI in higher education. On the basis of this, the Association of African Universities decided to base their celebrations. They have annual celebrations around certain issues in education and topics within education. They based it on ethics and AI, data and AI ethics, excuse me, this year. And so as such, they are starting to find a voice and a platform within these global debates. Off the back of these webinar series came the campaign for data ethics in higher education, which has been really quite successful. We've rolled that out across the world, and we're campaigning for the integration of data ethics in higher education courses across the globe in order to allow researchers and students to learn more really about what their responsibilities are in this field. So now on to the reason that we brought you all together today. Apart from listening to our wonderful Sabina talk about all of her work, we are also wanting to hear from you and to get some feedback from you on our 3 pillars on which we're going to be basing our work going forward. So just a little reminder of those 3 pillars. So the policy and networks, bringing together diverse actors and stakeholders to shape the future of data governance. Education, and we're looking to bolster training in ethical data science and ethical AI worldwide. And engagement, fostering equity in responsibility in data practices, which we're basing on research. So I would like now to introduce Sabina Leonelli, who is our PI and the Scientific Director of the Ethical Data Initiative, to talk about Data in the Age of XAI, I believe the title is. Thank you.
It's just behind. In any case, well, they put together the slides, and it's a really great honor to be here. I'm delighted that you could all come today. I'm very aware of the fact that it's the start of the semester here almost, so people are particularly busy, and I look forward to meeting all of you that I haven't met in person as yet in the coming hours, or certainly in the years to come. So it's great to be able to bring this initiative to TUM. And what I'm going to be doing in this talk is to just briefly try to introduce some of the motivations behind it, also coming from the kind of work I've been doing in this area, and give you a sense of what we would like to do, and also where I'm personally coming from, and very much with the intention of throwing this open to your reflections, your feedback, your experiences, and really trying to move as quickly as possible from this kind of more frontal, boring, blah, blah, Sabina talks to we'll just talk together and having a very interactive part of the event, which is really what we are here for. I thought I would start from this question for today, for various reasons. I'm sure you're actually probably more aware of them than I am, but just to give you a sense, in November, I was giving a presentation in the European Commission around the role of data, data science, AI, and open science in the current landscape of research at large. And after this presentation, two of the commissioners came up to me and said, I mean, this is really nice that you're doing all this research, documenting the challenges and some of the problems that we are having. But we have generative AI now. It doesn't matter. Everything is getting sorted magically. You know, it's yet another magical technology pill that we're supposedly swallowing all, and it solves all the problems. And I thought I'd just start from saying why I don't think this is quite what is going on. So first consideration then I want to make is really, what do I mean by the status quo here, and where do I think that initiative like this, in collaboration with many initiatives that are going on, which are relevant to this here and elsewhere in the world, can do some interesting work. First of all, of course, there's been a lot of work on the domain of data ethics. Thankfully, we did make great advancements in the last few years, certainly in the last 2 decades that I've been involved in this kind of work, particularly lots of really useful work on framing principles, like thinking about what the potential approaches could be to this issue. In fact, I think a lot of the practical problems remain, and potentially they're growing. The advent of generative AI and new, at least accelerated systems by which we can browse and mine data from all over the digital space and kind of bring it to bear to a variety of problems are actually accelerating concerns regarding privacy of the data. How do we actually monitor that? How do we try and preserve that? Trust between the people who are contributing to the data ecosystem and need to have a sense of what is actually happening with their information, and also lots of concerns with the quality of the information and the data that are to be found online. I'll come back to this issue in detail in a second. I think there's this misguided expectation, as I said, that generative AI will fix particularly data quality issues, by triangulating the data. I've been talking a lot about this problem in my work over the last few years. I see this as basically, this is another version of the big data myth on steroids. Like now, we have even more triangulation, even more data, so all the problems will magically go away. What I see instead, and I think many people with me, including no doubt many of you, is a huge rise, not just in the potential, but the reality of misinformation, even just through the amount of synthetic data that are kind of flooding the digital space, and together with lots of problematic data sets that we find in there. And in fact, decreasing investment potentially in setting up quality controls for data sets and trustworthy infrastructures, again, under this idea that, well, we now have XAI, so we don't need to worry about these things. And of course, at the very same time, we see an increase of what we may call potential data monopolies, right, where a few actors in the system are appropriating this space and at the very least setting the rules of the game, while a lot of people who are contributing the information in the first place and hopefully would want to make use of what is happening are left outside. And there is a lot of opacity. around what is actually being held in terms of data, by whom, and how in fact is used. So in that sense, data ethics, I think, continues to be a really, really important concern. And despite all the great advancements, there continues to be relatively scarce coordination between all the various initiatives that we see around the world around the implementation of data ethics frameworks and different forms of training that may support that for a variety of different publics and participants in this ecosystem. I think most concerning to me, and I'll come back to this at the very end of this talk, ethics continues to be viewed by very many actors and very many policy actors as something which is somewhat contextual, can be kind of set aside to some extent from the real work of actually doing the data science and doing kind of dealing with quality control in a research sense. And I think this is really problematic. And we do need a lot of emphasis, I think, on producing both generic and domain-specific training in data ethics that goes beyond the need to, of course, have ways of certifying the fact that people are complying with legal frameworks and complying with general kind of rules around data ethics. But this is something that actually goes deeper, I think, into the practice of science. So one of the things that particularly I'm interested in my work, and I think is very much also an underlying concern for the Ethical Data Initiative, is to try and build more capacity for actors that have been marginalized in the setup and the governance of data spaces so that they can actually take more central space. And this is really to try and counter what I, together with many other people, see in fact as a widening of what we traditionally call digital divide, like who is actually involved in participating in thinking through how data are going to be used and who is going to have access to digital technologies, and of course the power differential that are underpinning this. And the priority here is to try and involve as much as possible a variety of different actors, which are typically kept, you know, as Chit was already mentioning, a bit outside of the space, including small and medium enterprises, public administration, low resource research environment, which are maybe less visible than, say, TUM, and civil society organizations. So what does it mean also to move the status beyond the status quo when it comes to more academic or research-related concerns? I think what we're seeing here is an increasing recognition, which I think is great, including by magazines like Nature magazine or the Science, of the fact that there's been a long shadow of discrimination, racism, and colonialism over what counts as best practice in research. At the moment, there is an attempt to try and re-examine that and to think what this may mean in research. And of course, this relates to the fact that we know that the academic environment and generally the production of science is now an uneasy relationship with the public interest. I mean, this concept is being used all over the place, but in fact, what it may mean for academia continues to be at stake, and there's far too little discussion about that. Now, acknowledging the fact that there are these issues doesn't mean that we know what to do about them. I think we're still very stuck in this question around what are the implications and what do we actually do about this. At the same time, of course, as you know, and this is one of the bases also of the open science movement, there continues to be a very strong culture of self-referential kind of ivory tower type of academic publishing, the ways in which we're thinking about a lot of our research far too often, despite attempts to innovate also in this space, is driven by the imperative to produce a lot of outputs, to produce them quickly, and to publish in prestigious journals, rather than thinking about the quality of the outputs and whether they're reproducible or not. And there continues to be very little incentives for engagement with audiences and expertises which are non-academic. And of course, this is where there is some public publishing happening. There is still an idea that something like data and related components of research, like models and methods, samples, software, are second-tier outputs compared to the production of articles. And there are questions around the sustainability of data infrastructures, both digital and physical. And of course, we're not entirely aware of what is happening in the world that is financed by industry and military concerns. And so there are big questions, for those of you who are aware of the FAIR principles, around how to even make data findable, given the amount of research that's going on in there that's not very well documented and accounted for. So I think, just to be a bit provocative, one of the things that I think could be underpinning an initiative like the Ethical Data Initiative is the idea of going beyond privacy as a big concern for data ethics. Of course, that remains an enormous concern, and it's wonderful that there has been a lot of work around this, including for many people in this room, and that it needs to continue to be. But I think this cannot just be the only center of attention. And in fact, sometimes I think talking only about privacy as the big ethical concern when it comes to data circulation can actually sometimes be appropriated as almost as a fig leaf to say, well, I mean, all we need to be concerned of is who controls the data, who controls data traffic. And in fact, this then just leaves intact the assumption that data can be treated and should be treated as some sort of tradable, commodified asset. Well, I think the whole discussion around data as a potential common good, as something that needs to be at the disposal of society for a variety of purposes and a variety of ways, needs to still be in play here. Which also leads me to think about whether we can think about data ethics as going beyond discussions around the ownership of data. Again, these are very, very important discussions, but I think certainly among my colleagues in philosophy, there's been big debates around whether any and all data should even be conceptualized as ownable in any ways. I actually really would disagree with that personally. And there are big, big issues here around what we mean by data sovereignty and how do we conceptualize that in national terms, in regional terms, in terms of citizen communities, for instance. There are big issues around potential misinterpretation of data. What does it mean not to just, release the data so people can use them, but actually provide some conditions under which data can be appropriately used for whichever goals people may have. We know very well, of course, you know that better than me, that there are big limits to the notion of informed consent in these kinds of areas, particularly when the repurposes of data is so extensive and so distributed across the data ecosystem. And we're looking at constant abuse of power in these kinds of environments. One of the things that many people here have been working with, and certainly have also been trying to work towards, is thinking about alternatives, such as thinking about data licenses for particular uses of data, which will be mediated by appropriate institutions or bodies that can act as a sort of meso-governance to try and think about access and purposes for data distribution. But of course, there's all sorts of different ways in which one can conceptualize that. Another question that I think also relates back to the question of AI is big emphasis on explainability as yet another sort of magical formula that will give us great results. As long as we manage to explain everything that's going on with the use of data in AI, then we're going to be fine. And I mean, of course, many of you are working directly in AI and know that there's an extent to which thinking about AI as explainable, particularly when it comes to machine learning and deep neural network, is almost an oxymoron. I mean, there is a sense in which this actually is almost by definition an unexplainable system. Not only that, but the question is, even if we manage in some cases to make some of the technical work more accessible, who are we expecting that would engage with a level of technical understanding, and why would people need to do this? And so I think there needs to be a different way of thinking about setting up trust and trustworthy relationship in this space that can actually be more realistically used in society and in our everyday approaches to data of different kinds. By the way, I'm sorry that the last bit of my slides is never visible, but I can kind of cover that in any case. So some of the work that I've been doing in this area have been very much focusing on data mobility. Why thinking about the mobility of data? Because to me, without actually thinking about data moving around, in fact, there cannot be a question of discovery based on data-intensive methods, and also, very, very difficult to think about applications within AI tools if data don't circulate at all. So a lot of my research has been concerned with the framing of the data ecosystem and how data actually flow or not flow in and out of it, and actually how that happens, under which conditions, and what are the potential challenges and obstacles to those kinds of movements. And of course, this is very important, both so that we manage to actually deal with the amount of data being circulated across the data ecosystem, and more generally, the digital transformation of research that we're all kind of having to contend with, trying to feed AI-powered innovation, and build, of course, on a very extensive, centuries-long history of people within research and beyond, sharing materials, sharing material collections, and connecting that to traces and kind of, numerical notations, measurements that become ever more digitalized as we got into the 20th century, try to involve diverse publics and diverse forms of scrutiny in the distribution and dissemination of the data, so that indeed it can serve the role of actually putting different audiences and expertises in contact with each other, and ultimately ensure the production of reliable knowledge. So this has been work that's been going on well over 10 years, that has involved lots of different projects and different kinds of funding. I will just briefly mention 2 projects that have been very much linchpin, at least for me, for this kind of work, both of them funded by the European Research Council. One what took place between 2014 and 2019 was called the Epistemology of Data Intensive Science. And what we did in there was to track what we call data journeys, so how data move from places where they're being produced and generated to places where they're being disseminated in a variety of ways, or infrastructured, if you want, to sites where they're actually being reused, again, in a variety of different ways. And here we focus particularly on databases as a sort of window to look at under the conditions under which the kind of labor needed for data movements to happen. And also we looked at a lot of cases of data reuse, particularly looking at situations where the same type of data set end up being reused in for a variety of purposes. Another project which I'm very much in the middle of now is the project called The Philosophy of Open Science for Diverse Research Environments. And here we moved on to think about the broader conditions for even thinking about the dissemination of any forms of output in research, and how that relates to the open science, open access movement more generally, but also the history of the very idea of openness in research. And what we're doing here is we're considering both the diversity of different research environments, the different ways in which they're structured, different goals, different kinds of background knowledge and assumptions, and of course, different kinds of resources that are available to people around the world. And also, in relation to that, the huge inequity we very often find between research environments, both in terms of resources, in terms of visibility, and in terms of their ability to actually work in particular ways. We have a variety of different case studies, very often based in different places around the world, and also grounded on qualitative research together with many of our... Oh, can I get rid of this? Sorry, many of our stakeholders. Oh, that needs to be done manually. Thank you. All right. So just to briefly go through some of the main challenges that I see associated to the idea of data mobility. One of them is not just how we develop, but in fact, how we maintain data infrastructures. That continues to be a huge theme because, of course, we live in an era where, as you well know, innovation is something that needs to happen sharp and fast. And then once things are created, you move on to the next new thing. And of course, this absolutely doesn't work in a situation where the data ecosystem, once it's set up, needs even more investment to actually keep working in the ways in which you intend it to work. Given all the work that needs to be done to maintain data resources, to update them in the correct way, and make sure that they continue to be reliable in time, and also that whatever you're adding on to them actually also is consistent with what already is in there. Add to this the concerns around the environmental impact of the cloud, of course, and increasing understanding of the fact that we are reaching a situation where servers and computing facilities used to uphold the data ecosystem are going to very soon reach a sort of point of saturation where they're going to really create a very, very severe environmental impact. And so what do we do around that? Investment doesn't necessarily really focus on upkeep and the resilience of the data ecosystem. Is actually very difficult, even among national funders. I consult with them a lot, and I know that they're all in big trouble around this because they know it takes a lot of investment, but they know investing in that will take a lot of money away from investing on new research. So this continues to be a huge tension. And that means that actually, really, when one looks at least certainly the publicly funded data ecosystem space, there's very little sustainability to it beyond the next 5 years or so. It's a really big question how we're going to keep going beyond the next 5 to 10 years, which is a big difference from previous eras in research where people were building big archives, big libraries that were supposed to last for millennia. And not exactly where we are at the moment. And of course, this relates to an idea of data curation and stewardship itself as something which is just a sort of technical concern, very much a service activity that is not really recognized as being integral to research efforts, and the fact that researchers on the ground tend to still now get relatively little expert support on data management, certainly in institutions which are not quite as well resourced as TUM here. So we have problems in this sense. There's also, of course, huge issues with the limits of standardization efforts in this area. One of the big keywords for thinking about data mobility is interoperability. We have here the general director of the Research Data Alliance, and she knows more than anybody the difficulties that there are in trying to, on the one hand, standardize as much as possible data formats so that people can indeed benefit from them around the world, across different research cultures, across different domains. But at the same time, every time you standardize, you lose, of course, system-specific knowledge, and you lose connections to domain-specific uses. And getting that balance right, very often it's a question of actually specific uses of the data. It's not something that you can establish in general. Add to this the fact that because, of course, there have been lots of efforts to try and standardize data formats, this actually has inserted yet another questions of inequity into the data ecosystem, because, of course, almost, by definition, the people who end up doing a lot of work on data governance and standardization are the people who have the resources, opportunities, time, and money to do so. Lo and behold, most of those groups are in the global north. Most of those groups are in powerful universities who have the resources to do this. And, despite a lot of willingness and attempts to try and hear a diversity of voices, you still have a situation where most of the databases that we have now, certainly in the public area, display the outputs of rich English-speaking labs, which are working with a very popular research transition, rather than those who are maybe still very important socially, but less visible and less, topical, if you want, and deal with tractable data formats. And of course, a clear example of this within biology as a whole is the question of sequence data and genomic data. Labs that are poorer, more unfashionable, kind of based in developing countries or simply low-resourced regions of the world, and efforts by non-scientists tends to be, the involvement tends to be low, and very often at the receiving end of the efforts, rather than actually being involved in the governance and the design of some of these initiatives. And we're seeing here really an increase in digital divide, with increasing inequity between places which are visible, have power, have the opportunity to intervene in standardization, and places which, in fact, feel ever more excluded from those dynamics, which are very much now some of the locations that we're working with in the context of my project on open science. And now coming to the challenge of the lack of quality checks, what we're seeing here is we have huge difficulties in these big data ecosystems in actually locating sources of error, evaluate data provenance, evaluate data quality. And this is particularly the case when, as almost always at the moment, data basically go outside of users by competent communities that kind of know each other and actually get exported across different domains in ways that couldn't be foreseen when data were initially produced. Data quality assessment continues to be very data and domain specific. A lot of people keep working on the question of how do we set up kind of more universal criteria for assessing data quality, and beyond a certain set of minimum standards, mostly to do with the presentation of statistical data. Actually, we're still very much at a moment where we recognize that this really cannot be done in a generalized sense. Also because, of course, what counts as high quality data varies depending on the use that the data put towards. So this is all part of the context of them. And also very often what we're seeing, certainly in scientific environments, is that determining the quality of the data depends on actually having access and some familiarity to the original materials and the instruments that were used to produce the data in the first place, which very often is just not the case, particularly when one thinks about legacy data. So, right, data produced 5 years ago, where people were using different instruments, is already now proving problematic in some corners of research. And of course, there's also lots of problems, and some of our colleagues working in the Office for Statistical Regulation, for instance, in the UK, are working on this, on trying to establish systematic and periodic reviews of statistical and computational resources and methods and tools that are used to then work on the data, which is a big part of this story. The challenge of sensitive data, I think I don't really need to say much about this to this audience, but just to point to the fact that we are not just talking about personal data here. And most of my work in this area has been on environmental data and plant and crop related data. And and the question here is to really point out the fact that very similar issues on this data apply as to personal data. We need forms of governance over access and reuse, and yet we are in a relatively hostile environment for that. There's lots of commercial opportunism, say, for instance, about data about crops and cultivation at the moment, relatively high opacity around, what is being investigated and why. Relative lack of regulation and certainly enforcement of regulations over data dissemination and commercialization of the results of that data dissemination. And of course, we're still seeking clarity on the legal regimes that underpin it all. Despite a lot of efforts, implementation questions are still very, very problematic. We've been doing a lot of work, especially with the European Commission, thinking about the complexity of data stewardship and how this can in fact fit existing regimes of knowledge production, including rewards and incentive regimes in this area. So this is just a list of some of the issues that, after doing a lot of survey work with a variety of different audiences within academic researchers, people feel are affecting their ability to disseminate data and to participate, for instance, in open data efforts, which we documented in much of our work with the European Commission, especially for the Open Science Policy Platform, that was work that lasted for about 4 years and concluded maybe 3-4 years ago. And this relates to this question around, do we have the right incentive for the world of research in thinking about data ethics and data dissemination? No, I would say is the answer, despite, again, lots of attempts to try and get there. Very few incentives at the moment for thinking about what responsible dissemination may look like, and really, in fact, encouraging on the ground the scrutiny of research components. Very, very few incentives, certainly within academia, for any form of transdisciplinary engagement and involved in different kinds of community in research. We all tend to do it on top of the kind of research outputs we're expecting to produce in our academic careers. This is true, I think, all over, across many, many countries. And again, what are the incentives really to develop technology, which is not just cutting edge, what we can do, but in fact is what we ought to do, encouraging a reflection around what may be more sustainable and more responsible, and I think also lags behind. Which leads me to the final and biggest concern that I have, questions of injustice when it comes to data dissemination and data sharing. Many of the people that engage in data sharing and provide data to the data ecosystems are actually not recognized for their contributions, very often not consulted around how data may be used or interpreted. So she already alluded to this when thinking about the situation with farming communities in agriculture. And this is a situation which is right with what we call in philosophy epistemic injustice. So types of injustice which has to do with the distribution of knowledge and how people actually are using knowledge around the world. And trying to counter these forms of injustice means trying to, first of all, making some efforts in data sharing and modeling more inclusive, try to align a broader variety of perspectives into this. And this is something that, for instance, we've been trying to study and collaborate with in some of the work I've been doing in agriculture and crop data sharing, recognizing the fact at the same time that we're looking at, certainly in this area, at a situation where the system of data sourcing and circulation is very much controlled by a certain set of businesses and data analytics company. And this is very often not inclusive of the voice of farmers, as Suchit was also saying, or the voice of local breeders. And it's certainly biased towards a very particular view of what it means to think about agricultural productivity, which is very market-oriented in very particular ways. And this, in fact, creates a problem, which I keep bumping against in my research, and I'm hoping to be able to discuss as part of the Ethical Data Initiative with many of you, which is the fact that trying to make data, the development of data ecosystems more inclusive sometimes actually ends up being a glorified form of bioprospecting. So just basically getting lots of people to participate, give their information. Isn't that wonderful? Now it's all accessible on the internet, and then, the particular company that's interested in developing a product out of that comes in, sweeps all of that information, recognizes nothing of the work that's been going into producing the data ecosystem, and uses to produce a product that sometimes actually has a negative effect on some of the communities that were originally involved in producing that data ecosystem. And we see this all over the place, all over the world, very systematically, certainly in this area. And, we can talk about marine, for instance, we can talk about other areas that we're involved in, but certainly I can talk about this, I think, after a while of working on this. So we've been doing quite a few case studies and work both with broader organizations, including in fact Godan, dealing with the distribution of crop-related data or agriculture-related data around the world, but also particular institutions, especially in Ghana, in Greece, in Northern Italy, in Nigeria, that are involved in actually trying to create more inclusive communities of practice around the sharing of crop data. And this is a situation where we constantly find that we have marginalized researchers which have relatively low resources involved in these kinds of efforts, and they have access to satellite technology and global databases, but this tends to be unsystematic and very poorly resourced and not particularly well organized. All sorts of issues there. One of the things we've been involved in now for quite a few years is trying to think about what is the right type of data semantics to distribute the data. This is an example of the crop ontology, where we're thinking about how do we organize information around the traits of plants, in this case a cassava root, so that they can be accessible not just by certain kinds of researchers working within certain kind of agrotech set of innovations, but also people that are working on the fields, people that are working in the food industry, and various other stakeholders here. We've been looking at the ways in which some of the data systems that are put in use can assist things like field trials happening in different locations around the world. This is in our collaborators in Nigeria at the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture, and ways in which some of this work is enriched by increasingly more automated ways of providing information, especially about the phenotyping of plants, so not just the genomics, but in fact, all different characteristics of growing plants. How do we study them? How do we disseminate and share that information? And of course, there are very important global initiatives that are trying to put a lot of effort, huge amounts of partners, huge amounts of resources going towards trying to create common repositories for a lot of this information. But this question around how do we do this ethically, how do we do this in a way that is inclusive, continues to be a challenge for all of the people involved in initiatives such as this one, which is from the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, and is something that really underpins our own efforts in the area. So what are the dreams? Just to kind of give you a sense again, for those of you who are not very well versed on agricultural research, the dreams underpinning this kind of data sharing, I think, reflect the dreams that underpin many other data sharing efforts in other domains, trying to increase access to otherwise inaccessible resources and networks, trying to integrate better a variety of different perspectives, quite literally different fields around the world at different scales. And here specifically, the attempt is to try and reimagine agriculture further away from just thinking about the kind of high-yield monoculture that are basically destroying our planet at the moment, and address climate emergency by trying to valorize better environment-specific kind of more ecological approaches to cultivation, and try and leverage a lot of the improvements and development we've had also in the data area around how do we accumulate information around biological resources, what kind of data linkage and knowledge information tools that we use, and how do we in fact bring in local knowledge as part of these kinds of efforts. And all of this is to some extent happening in a very, very valuable and important vision to work towards. However, what we're also finding on the ground, and I think very well documented, not just by my group, but by many other people working in this field, is that the dreams come with quite a few nightmares. And the nightmares include, as I said already, a huge expansion of the digital divide here, where people who actually don't have an entry point into this wonderful, ideal data ecosystem feel forever excluded from it, and in fact, more and more retreating into exclusion. So very uneven capacity to participate in this. A lot of the efforts to share data beyond molecular sequence data in biology, in fact, continue to revolve around molecular markers as reference points. So people who are working on other aspects of biology, kind of more phenotypic data sets, actually tend to be, in a sense, positioned as a secondary contributor to these efforts, which again is generating all sorts of issues in terms of who then participates in these efforts, but also how the knowledge is used, what kind of knowledge is produced out of this very much still focusing on trying to create some sort of new best variety that can then feed another generation of monocultures rather than really thinking through agroecological efforts. Very often the standard that I use, as I already mentioned, misalign at least with some of the goals and the available expertise of the people that are involved in these efforts. There are, of course, as for all data efforts, enormous surveillance concerns here. Pretty much any technology used now to do any form of farming has become a data production machine. And the question continues to be, who then controls this? Who has access to those resources? Why are they not made available in any way to others? And how are we thinking about this mass surveillance of farming behavior and the ways in which it's being put to work? For instance, in the insurance industry, for instance, in the provision of particular packages for fertilizers and ways to take care of your soil and so on and so forth. There continues to be huge benefit sharing problems in this field and is in others, but here is really endemic. The market control here is huge. There continues to be a huge debate about how do we recognize the contributions of farmers and farming organizations to all of this innovation, and they continue with no resolution. We've gotten to at least start discussing financial compensation, but this doesn't get to the core of the issue around how do we determine what innovation is actually being developed here and how are people kind of being brought into the governance of the type of innovation produced out of these data sharing regimes. And ultimately, we're looking at a regime of agricultural development, which is very much data fed, but in fact has a tendency to erase cultural, biological, scientific, and semantic diversity, despite being fed through all of this diversity. So it's kind of a rather paradoxical situation we're looking at. Very, very briefly, also to give you a sense of another part of the work that we're doing with my group, which is looking more at questions of public health, epidemiology, and the sharing of kind of more medicine-related data. And this is work that's been happening very much together with Nathaniel Sheehan, which I don't see with there, in Exeter. And here it's a question of looking, and certainly, I mean, this work was already going on before, but it's gotten slightly amplified by the pandemic, as you can well imagine, looking at what happens when you have a situation such as a health emergency, where there's a huge imperative to try and very quickly pull together data sharing, use open science so that we can develop innovation that we need very urgently, like, for instance, in the realization of vaccines. And what we've been trying to document is the fact that while there seemed to be this push to say, well, we have the technological opportunity to share all this stuff, we have to do it right away, everybody needs to get on board with open science and open data sharing, this is going to be the way to get the best possible innovations out of this. We documented many cases where, in fact, actually taking a little bit of time, not too much, but actually taking some steps to consult various communities involved as stakeholders in some of those innovations, patient groups, people who are affected by COVID in a variety of ways, social services, local health authorities. Wherever this has happened, it actually has led to more robust innovation and potentially a much better longer-term implications and effect for the kind of data science-fed innovations that were being developed. One of the cases that we're looking at a little bit more in detail very recently is comparing the ways in which data, and particularly data around the mutants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that, of course, causes COVID-19 have been shared on global databases. There have been several efforts to do this, and we'll be looking at two of them, the so-called GZAID effort and the COVID-19 data portal. And these are two big infrastructures that have rather different governance structures. One of them, the COVID-19 data portal, and now, of course, I'm hugely simplifying, is very much geared toward data actionability. So try and leverage all the latest ways of thinking about open access to data so that we can make data usable in a variety of ways through different forms of data mining and different kinds of algorithms. GZAID has been much more focused on providing a kind of governance framework for data that took account of trying to recognize as much as possible who was involved in donating data in the first place, and in fact establish a sort of at least minimal governance around how the participation in the effort would be recognized by, for instance, asking people that would be reusing the data to acknowledge people that have been donating data in the first place. This, of course, a very complex for anybody who is aware of this case. This is a complex case. We can talk about this if you want. But certainly one of the things that we've been seeing is that both governance models used here have advantages and disadvantages. And certainly the idea of just openness as free sharing of information, just putting all the data online, make it available and accessible without any kind of governance, any kind of framing, wasn't necessarily conducive to more participation and more inclusivity, because it made a lot of contributors, particularly for low-resourced environment, more nervous around what would then going to happen with the information that we're going to provide once it was actually made available publicly. So just to very briefly touch on the question of reproducibility, this is another idea that together with the appeal to generative AI is sometimes banned around as something that can be a magic formula for resolving some of the issues I've been talking about. And here I just want to point out that I don't think, even of course, if we need to do a lot of work on improving reproducibility standards, at least across a variety of domains, this doesn't necessarily fix concerns around the quality and the mobility of research and research outputs. It doesn't necessarily help you to distinguish between what can be seen as unintentional mistakes, attempts to cheat, situations of fraud, constructive versus malicious. And also it doesn't provide any kind of universal solution because, as I think now is becoming more and more recognized, reproducibility tends to mean very, very different things for very good reasons in different domains and apply to different problems. And in fact, insisting on certain very strict versions of reproducibility, which we may call computational reproducibility, so actually just reproducing outputs through the reproduction of the same exact methods at all points as a kind of way of assessing the quality of research, and actually having these kinds of criteria risks enshrining very particular forms of quantitative methods as a gold standard, in which in fact is damaging to a lot of other fields of research, particularly research which has to build like qualitative research, for instance, on expert judgment and know-how. And in fact, doesn't really help us to address the more systemic issue I've been pointing to do with rewards and incentives. One of the things I've been trying to work with in my group at the moment, that I've been trying to at least present the manifesto idea behind this in this little book that just came out, is the idea that very often when we're thinking about open data and open science, there is an expectation that, what we need to do is, first of all, make everything transparent. We slap everything on the internet, make it available to people, and that will give us a sense of quality because then people can scrutinize all these resources and improve them, and this will in turn lead to inclusion. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment in my group, and I've been doing in the past with lots of collaborators, points to almost the opposite situation, where in fact, if you don't think about who are your interlocutors when putting together data mobility pathways, when thinking about who are you actually including in your data ecosystem in the first place, you're going to find it very difficult to actually have people who engage in assessing the quality and improving and maintaining the quality of your data sets, and you're not really going to get a lot of transparency. While in situations where inclusion is really being put forward as the key thing, then eventually you get a data ecosystem which may contain maybe not all the data, maybe less comprehensive than you would want, but is transparent in a different kind of sense. So the bottom line, what I really want to get with this is trying to push an idea of ethical data practices as absolutely integral to research, not something that philosophers will do in the room next door, and then they produce some principles, and then it is up to people on the ground working with the data thinking, okay, well, that's nice that we need to be inclusive, but what does it really mean? But really think about the processes of research, the ways in which data are being used technically, and all the different ways in which ethics actually intersects with that. Something that Luis Bezardenat, which is also in this room, has been called microethics, right? Something that really is part of the technical work, the scientific work that is being done here, trying to really support participative data governance, recognizing the fact that data use is value-laden, unavoidably is going to include some people and exclude others, is going to be driven by certain values and not others. And so the question becomes, how do we make them more explicit? How do we make the human component of data work and data science much more explicit and possible to articulate and then critique and scrutinize? Trying to work towards identifying and analyzing assumptions, theories, and values that are used to develop and evaluate research, including, of course, all the gaps, the things that are missing, the representation that is not there in these kinds of environments. Trying to understand better the motivations for why people are doing things in a variety of different ways, rather than just complain about the fact that, oh gosh, people, you know, in this lab, even just members of the same lab, seem to be using different methods and adopting different standards, but trying to understand better where does the diversity come from, what are the motivations, what are the very often good justifications for maintaining that and trying to cultivate that. And obviously trying to assess the implications of setting up data ecosystems in this way for the production of knowledge, for different kinds of stakeholders, and ultimately for planetary health. I think, at least for me, from my perspective, this is the bottom line that also motivates the ways in which we've been talking with Kate and Sujit about setting up the ethical data initiative. You know, as you will see also when we get into the workshops, we're still very much in an embryonic stage of thinking about what the pilot project could be, building on some of the efforts that many of us have been doing in this area. But I was very intentional to try and bring that to you and also hear from your expertise and your experiences in this kind of landscape. What do you think the priority should be going forward, given the kind of big challenges that I've just tried to outline? And just to say something very briefly, and then I'll leave it to what I think are at least some of the stepping stones, also summarizing some of the work that, some of what I've been saying so far, that we're at least able to build a little bit on now, coming from certainly like the experience that I've had in doing some of this work. I think the at least intention to try and support data sharing in relation to social needs and prospective reuse, rather just in relation to making data accessible, who knows to whom and for which purpose, but really try and think about this in a way which is much more socially and goal-directed. Trying to think about scientific work in a way that actually aligns and constantly iterates and informs policy work, given that we know how important governance issues are in this area, and also the interplay that there needs to continue to be between governance, policy, legal, and actual implementation of the ground of some of those issues. An emphasis on transdisciplinarity as much as possible, not working just within this room, not working within academia per se, but having our work informed as much as possible by collaborations that span across different parts of society, and particularly research that tends to be manualized and is carried out in low-resort settings. I mean, big tech, I think, has enough resources. The question is, what can we do to make sure that other social settings which actually don't have that kind of resources or capacity get more of that and get supported by initiatives like this? Obviously, we're coming from having quite a strong grounding in a more academic sense in the philosophical, historical, and social scientific studies of data use, which I hope is a resource, because we do have a lot of information coming from our fields around what people are actually doing on the ground, what kind of conditions work and do not work for which purposes in terms of making use of data. And I think this is something that whose use could be maximized in thinking about data ethics. It hasn't quite been integrated into the global discourse as much as it could. Obviously, we have education as a very focal point for us, both because, of course, this is a university-led initiative, because we have access to wonderful student communities, because we are very aware, certainly after carrying out research and also, you know, we've been setting up data ethics programs at University of Exeter now for more than 10 years, including to professionals in the area. So we're very aware of how important it is to provide training to people that then go into various kinds of industries and various kinds of social domains doing this kind of work. One of the things that I'm certainly very interested in continue doing is to think about data use in a very issue-based and domain-specific ways, particularly working with collaborators in these fields. And of course, I welcome very much support from those of you who are working in different fields and can add your expertise in building bridges across those domains and within those domains. And ultimately, really trying to work towards, you know, together with many other initiatives in this space that are trying to do this, coordinate the initiatives that there are and try to integrate them as closely as we can with day-to-day practice of research communities in different parts of the world. And with this, I just want to also remind you, of course, many of the values that we are trying to foster here have also been adopted by UNESCO, by the UN, in all of their latest work on what they're calling inclusive open science, which in fact, many of us, I think in this room, have participated in trying to shape as a kind of policy. And I want to thank especially my open science research group at the moment, who is just giving me motivation and happiness every day. So I want to thank them for all their work. All right, thank you. Yeah.
So thank you, Sabina, for your enlightening talk. We will now have some time for a Q&A session. So please raise your hand, state your name and affiliation, and then I will bring the microphone to you so our online participants can hear your question. After some time, maybe let's say 10 minutes, I will switch to Rahel. And so for online participants, you can now type your questions to the chat and she will read as many as we can fit into the time slot. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, Samantha Hearn, University College London. So in the ethics bit, are we just thinking about the capture, storage and dissemination, or are we thinking about the entire pipeline? Because the hardware, the physical infrastructure that all this sits on is incredibly dirty, from the extraction of the material through to how it's decommissioned. And that whole piece is massively harmful to exactly these communities that aren't benefiting from that data. So are we thinking about that and educating people as much about that and that harm that I know that so many people just aren't aware of, as much as actually this needs to be fair and all these other things?
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for the comment. I think I can only agree with you. That is a very, very important piece of the puzzle. And there is this tendency still to forget, despite all the work that's been done to try and raise awareness in this area, that we're not looking at virtual systems in the sense that it's all up in the cloud, but actually these are very, very physical systems that have been fed through all sorts of different kinds of extractions, which are in themselves highly problematic. And of course, this relates back to all the kind of political economy, or what we are now calling generative AI, including all sorts of social political questions around where different components for these computing systems are coming from, and very delicate equilibria around the world around how this is being managed. So absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Of course, it speaks to a very important question, which I'm hoping that will be discussed later today, also for you to give us feedback on how to frame this, which is how do we even put boundaries if we need to an initiative like this, right? Because the question is, I completely agree that we need to look at the data pipeline in its entirety. Of course, there's a question here about where are we going to focus our attention of all these different concerns. So I think I would really, thank you for this, because I think it gives exactly an idea of how broad the space is and some of the core concerns here, but also a question mark around how do we then address the efforts within the initiative, whether it should be really targeting that as a priority or whether we should be looking also at other dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Jessica Snitzi, TU Munich. So thank you for sharing the challenges, which I find extremely relevant. So one question that I have has to do with governance, right? So what in terms of practicality, so what would be the best approach towards solving these challenges? Is it a top-down or a bottom-up strategy where, let's say, we locally agree to use a certain strategy, a certain approach to solve those challenges, or do we need some kind of central overview?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I suppose, for me, I don't particularly feel that I'm personally in a position to provide the big answer to this problem in general. I've been doing a lot of work thinking about this in relation to particular domains. And I think that's where, for me, it's been extremely useful to work both on the agricultural crop-related domain, kind of environmental data, and the biomedical epidemiological based domain, because I think there's a lot of lessons that have been learned already, or we're trying to learn them in the biomedical domain around what does it mean to have, in a sense, protected data silos, what does it mean to work with organizations like SAIL, for instance, is one of the secure data infrastructure organization that I've been working now for years, based in Wales, which is doing a lot of securitization around medical data collected in the UK and related to patient groups, and then try to facilitate this using research in ways which are ethical and responsible. These examples are wonderful examples of ways in which there has been bodies, institutions, investments set up to try and provide what we're calling a meso level of governance, where there's mediating institutions between, the concerns of users big and small, and the concerns of people who are providing and producing the data, and if you want to furnishing the data ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from some of those examples, especially from within biomedicine, that could be applied on the environmental side. And certainly, at least in my experience with the various organizations and cases I've been working with, it's typically been the case that the best examples I've seen of governance have been through the work of people working in this middle space, which were able to see things in a sense a little bit of a step removed from the everyday practices of people working on the ground, but at the same time, not quite at the level of big transnational organizations, which unavoidably are working at a different level and they're kind of too far removed from the daily practices of what is happening on the ground. So typically this kind of meso level is where I think a lot of the answers potentially could be found. But of course, this comes with the need for investments, the need for frameworks to really provide recognition to this level of work. In fact, too often people who are working in this space are all doing it because they believe in this, but actually they're not very well recognized for their efforts. I think many people in this room also pertain to that category.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. This is Andres Gonzalez. I'm TUM alum and data scientist. From my experience working with companies, it looks like there's no incentive for them to be ethical unless there's a law that enforces them. But at the same time, there's this dire feeling that regulation comes too slow. So the question is, what hope there is in the short term, in your opinion?
Well, this is very interesting because I've been working and having dialogue with lots of, especially startups, smaller organizations, kind of, up to middle level enterprises, where in fact there was a huge amount of interest to do ethical work beyond purely the legal framework. Partly because it wasn't really clear to them what the legal framework really allowed or didn't allow. And I'm sure many of our colleagues who are working in law here share this sense that we're still in a transition period where implementation is still a little bit up in the air, but also because they recognize that there is in fact value in being trustworthy, particularly for organizations and companies that may not have a huge market share and are trying to get one. And at a moment where there is actually increasing levels of distrust in some of the technologies available, social media, of course, is the paramount case here, for obvious reasons and for obvious, for very good reasons, in fact. And so I think in cases like this, I've been working with a few, for instance, data analytic companies in Italy, and working on ethical frameworks for their work and trying to formulate values for how they would approach their programming, how they would think about the intersection between open and closed in some of the products that we're producing, the ways in which they were thinking about coding. Does it all need to be a trade secret? No, in fact, it may be a good idea for our future development to open some of these up. So in fact, we can benefit from a broader engagement in our product and a better development going forward. Many of the things that, I would regard as ethical practices were also very well recognized to be something that in fact can help the companies develop, actually make a profit and have a bigger share of the market. So I think part of, also engaging with enterprise in these ways, trying to make them recognize that training in these areas doesn't necessarily take anything away from actually participating in the global market, but in fact could give you an advantage if you want to work in a particular way, of course. There has to be a fundamental moral commitment, I guess, to working in certain ways and not others. And obviously, one of the investments for me and many of my colleagues as people who are training data scientists all the time is to try and make people who are formed in data science so that they're aware that they have choices. It's not obvious that they have to go and work for the same big company, but in fact, there is a big data ecosystem out there made of people who have very different values. And part of their training is becoming aware of that and actually making informed choices about where they may end up working.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, just building up the questions just now from the floor as well as from your side as well. I definitely think that top-down and bottoms-up approach are very important, and maybe both can come together to solve a solution, to come up with the solutions. But also the multi-billion question is that should we have the top-down first or bottoms-up first? So should the government set the regulations and set the structure, frameworks, guideline first, or should we gather all the inputs from the ground, from the farmers, from the patients, or from the public interest, for example, first, and then we build up something concrete together? So I think this is also maybe something that I would also ask for your opinion.
Yeah, no, of course, I would love to hear what everybody in the room thinks about this. Thank you, because it is indeed $1 million question. In my experience, what seems to be working really well, also looking at other areas where ethical principles have been applied to research, is a kind of, processual iterative approach to regulation, when there is as much as possible an interplay between top-down and bottom-up. And which is why meso-governance for me is so important, because it provides this avenue of dialogue where there can be at least regular moments, repeated moments, where there is a check between what is actually happening at the level of regulation and the legal side and what is happening on the ground in terms of evolving practices. Of course, we all know that the top-down level will always lag behind, right? Because that's just the nature of these things. I mean, moving any kind of legislation or governance is going to be a juggernaut, which is going to take much, much longer to evolve than practices on the ground. But at the same time, that can actually be a good thing. The certain amount of conservatism that comes with governance can sometimes help to stabilize a situation where things are actually maybe sometimes moving too fast on the technological side and being in fact problematic socially. Ultimately, especially because we have this kind of techno-determinist imperative to just keep going with the latest technology, right? But at the same time, of course, it's important that governance keeps being checked against what are the problems that are emerging on the ground. I'm hoping at least some of the open science, the ways in which the open science governance is now evolving, hopefully may reflect a little bit of that, where we've gone through a period where it was all about access, all about putting stuff online, all about sharing things. Now there is an increase in recognition, hopefully, that this is not enough, that we need to look at questions of inequity that are created by the very idea of openness that is being implemented and how we should try and moderate that. But of course, that takes time and it takes constant speaking to by a variety of experiences on the ground. So I think partly that's what the Ethical Data Initiative is trying to participate in mediating these discussions between people who have all these really precious experiences on the ground and seeing how the field is evolving, what are the latest challenges, and people who are trying to implement governance and legislation at a very high level.
Hi, so I'm Lily. I'm a master's student here at the SDS department at TUM. I really found your consideration of kind of going beyond privacy, going beyond this sort of explainability of AI really interesting, almost arguing for this paradigm shift in the way we approach of ethical and governance frameworks of emerging technologies. And I was wondering if what emerging and critical questions you see as important for students and PhD students to look into at the moment to address these gaps and how we can actually bring these changes about in the way we approach.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I think there's a huge variety of ways. And in fact, I mean, my hope is that it's up to your generation to come up with ways of filling this in. And for me, the emphasis now is thinking about the existing gaps and how do we even identify those? How do we conceptualize things like inequities here? And what kind of considerations go into researching that and trying to think about how do we think about that constructively as much as possible? And also recognizing different forms of research that are not typically valued in many of the environments I'm in as potential sources of innovation. There's just so much creativity happening in lots of different parts of science which are not typically where people look for the latest cutting edge on what is happening in data science and AI. And instead, I think really need to be valued. So part of the work potentially is actually trying to document those kinds of situations better and try and follow them and collaborate with building capacity for much of this in a much more systematic way. And that's something, of course, that science studies hopefully is well equipped to do if we do it right and if we keep questioning our own methods and our own interventions. And trying to also think about, certainly that's one of the things we're considering as part of the Ethical Data Initiative, again, something we'd love feedback on, as much as possible, try and get particularly students to interface with problems that are happening on the ground. Lots of people that approach us from different parts of the world with particular challenges, very domain specific, for particular uses of data, particular situations they're dealing with, and actually having a situation where we create bridges between students who are interested in investigating those problems and are getting training in doing this a bit more systematically with a bit of academic background, also the research that's been done on those, and people who need that kind of expertise, but can also, of course, provide their own in really helping to frame the problems and sort of feedback on what is happening. I think creating bridges where we can have more and more and more of that work, which of course crosses countries, crosses regions, crosses domains, I think would be hopefully where we're trying to go in terms of implementing this also in thinking about the student population and bringing it in. But, you know, mostly I would love to hear from you.
Thank you. So we have 4 more questions in the room. Rahel, no questions online. So we are entering the coffee break slot, but I think we agree that maybe these 4 more questions, and then I think it's for the benefit of all to have the time to ask Sabina. So I go from the back to the front.
Yes, thank you very much for great talk and fantastic discussion, great answers as well. Timo Minzen is my name, Center for Advanced Studies in Bioscience Innovation Law. I've been working with the data a lot with the WHO and also wrote the report for the European Open Science Cloud. So this is all highly relevant, and also the data colonization issue and so on. I just wonder, I mean, your work is so important now that we have this increasingly complex jungle of regulations coming up on the EU level. We all know about the European, the AI Act, we know the health data space and all these regulations. And the devil is really in the detail here, and the devil is really in the implementation of these regulations, right? That's where we see a lot of issues, but also potential ways to solve problems with new technologies. So my first question is, how many lawyers are in the team? How do you collaborate with lawyers, like hardcore legally trained people? Because that's often where the action points comes, where the ethics are preparing the action points, right? And the second question is, how do you deal with, there is some amazing work at TUM on the quantum area, quantum encryption, quantum de-encryption. This will certainly be very important for the data ethics as well, and the data sharing and the data and privacy questions. How do you interact with these environments here? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, on the legal side, I think we're really blessed that we have a few experts in the room today, which are much, much better equipped than me to answer that question. And so the hope is that they would be as involved as possible in the Ethical Data Initiative. We will be looking to them to provide expertise. Certainly Boris and Moritz is somewhere here around, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think there is expertise there that we just need to keep collaborating across disciplines to try and resolve it. This said, I do think that there is a space for thinking about ethics beyond law. And I think that's a tendency that we've seen a lot, especially in discussions. For instance, I've written quite a bit together with other colleagues around discussions around fairness. How do we think about the notion of fairness? Very often, especially within the biomedical environment, this is being cashed out as something which is basically a legal issue. So how do we define legally the notion of fairness? I think this is incredibly important, but it's never going to come down to the level of everyday data practices, right? It's going to provide very important constraints. It's going to provide very important direction people need to go towards. I think this DPR has actually played a very, very important role in providing a direction, though the way in which it's been implemented, this is a long discussion. But I think it's very important also to have that much broader discussion that then ends up, iteratively feeding what is happening on the legal side and vice versa, because otherwise we lose sight of the fact that this is not just a question of what we are allowed to do. And I think in all the space, I mean, for me, one of my, my fears in this space, and it's been for a long time, is that this is going to end up going the same way that bioethics has gone. Not to say that bioethics has not achieved very important things in the medical domain, but I think in many ways it's become something that can be very easily seen as pigeonholed, particularly by policymakers, but also by scientists, as something that you need to kind of go through so you can actually, get your work done. And the hope here is that we may still have an opening to try and train data scientists in a way that they recognize that having ethical considerations is an integral part of the work, is not just a hoop to jump through, but it's actually part of what they're trying to do. Quantum computing, long discussion. I think there's work here, of course, at TUM that is very relevant to this, which I'm looking forward to engage with. I'm now the evaluator for one of the big efforts in Italy to try and sponsor quantum computing from the European level. Huge investment in Italy also in that sense. And the considerations around ethics certainly are just nascent. In fact, it's been really a struggle for me to try and get that whole environment. Not the researchers themselves, I mean, they're very interested in this, but in fact, the governance layer to recognize that this is something that really is investment now, rather than, as usual, waiting for when we have quite a lot of technologies in place and then thinking, oh, afterthought, how are we actually gonna, what impact is this gonna have? The usual story.
Sabina, thank you very much for your comprehensive talk. My name is Patrick van der Smacht, and I've been working in machine learning for over 3 decades. And for me, data has always been the little brother of AI, right? If you want AI. And I know that's a wrong view, but I've always, I've been trained that way, or we used to deal with data that way until Google came and showed that data itself also has value. So that changed a lot, but still, even today we have a dichotomy between data and machine learning, or data and AI, right? And I'm always surprised that this is still feels like two separate communities. I myself have started an initiative on ethics in AI, and there's no data in there, and this is the ethics in data initiative, right? So I would like to collaborate more on this, and it's AI is not your small sister, and data is not my small brother, or whatever you want. But I think we should do something together there, and make sure that, because for me data becomes problematic or interesting or anything the moment you use it.
Yeah, of course.
And before that, that's totally different. And the same for machine learning, right? Machine learning is maybe interesting for a paper before you put data in it, but even that's questionable. So let's put these initiatives on data and on AI on one table. And
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that. So I'll just accept the offer very happily to collaborate.
all right.
Just one note, however, I do not think that the data space is exhausted by uses through machine learning.
No, not
because
through
a lot
machine
of
learning.
data
No.
actually are physical.
No.
There's lots of data
There's
that
more
are not
than that.
machine readable, right? So I would just
Google
say
is your example, right?
the
Google,
yeah, exactly. I mean,
Google
the
used
only
not to be
thing
a
I would
machine
say
learning
to this is absolutely we need to really work at that intersection,
Yeah.
but with the awareness that there's lots of data work that is
Of course.
happening, which in fact
Yeah.
is not happening in digital space even.
Yeah,
sometimes, and that needs to
it is the
be-
use of data, be it machine learning or anything else.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, two last questions, and then we're going to coffee break.
Sorry, really awkward question again. So there's a underlying coloniality, we can argue, to a lot of how data is captured, manipulated, and deployed to people. With that in mind, are we the right people to be doing this? And how much should we be listening and facilitating and raising the voices of the people that, in a way, it's being done to? And how do we avoid doing ethics to the people that aren't empowered?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. Of course, that's kind of the main concern behind this whole initiative. The fact that now I've been recounting some of the things that I've been doing in my research so far, but I've also gotten more and more interested in just working very collaboratively, in fact, becoming ever more a capacity building resource rather than becoming, you know, the person that sits there and listens to people and then writes everything up and then here's my research done. I also think yesterday we were reflecting on this question as we were kind of reflecting on how to set up the EDI with a smaller group. And we also reflected on the fact that there is a place for trying documenting these efforts that I think people like us in this room are particularly well equipped to do, because, you know, we have, you know, cushy jobs that actually pay us to do this. And this is important in some policy arenas, important to raise awareness in a variety of different ways. But ultimately, I think certainly a lot of my work here, and I think the whole motivation behind this initiative is to try and make it as participative and as bottom-up as we possibly can. And so the idea is to try and involve as many people as possible from different parts of the world, working with the RDA, working with CODATA, working with organizations that already have very good links to a variety of different locations, as you know, we do in part with through some of the qualitative research that we are doing. And basically, you know, it's asking for your help to help us to do this as much as possible.
Framing to the design of the point of that, because that has
For example.
if we organize myself.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, understood. Completely agreed.
All right, Vincent from the Bavarian Economic Association and also from a startup industry, sort of. I have two questions, maybe a little bit more provocative. One is, why do it at all? I didn't fully get it. You mentioned a lot of words, which are very feel-good words, inclusivity and so on, like it all, you know, nobody's against it. But overall, I'm wondering, you know, what's sort of your vision when you're all done with your work and it's all implemented? You know, how does the world look different? Even if you included everyone, which even the people that don't want to be included, are we at a better place at the end because we forced everyone into being included? So I'm just wondering, sort of, you know, where are we going with that? So why do it all is my first thought or question. And the second is, now you're working on that space for quite a long time. So I'm wondering, like, so how do you do it in your own life, in your own work? Are you a role model? Like, you know, are you creating the best practice on how it should be done? With your own data, with your own, you know, data governance? Do you put it in the open? Like, do you not put it in the open? It's nice, you know, if you walk the talk, it would be nice to see, you know, how do you approach that?
Yeah, thanks so much. These are great questions. So also then I let you go into the coffee break. So trying to be brief. In terms of data practices, you're right. Of course, the attempt is also to try and practice your own talk for sure, and that's been a concern for a long time. With qualitative data, which is most of the data that I'm working with, this is of course particularly delicate because you have all these questions around sensitivity with people that we're working with and talking to. We have lots of sensitive transcripts of interview data, for instance. So we've been trialing now for a few years a way of actually providing the opportunity to our interlocutors to make the conversations they have with us and some of the ethnographic interactions they have with us open or not, depending on how they feel about that interaction. So we've been putting some of the kind of more qualitative data that we use certainly for the data science project online, but this has been done with two considerations in mind. One is whether the interlocutors we had were happy with us doing this, which of course doesn't just happen at the moment in which you're starting the work, but at the moment in which you finish the work with them, or at least you put a cap to the particular period. And also it's very much somewhere where I also tend to have a bit of a sensory role, in the sense that for some of the data that I put online, I'm not particularly interested in causing a lot of controversy or causing potential harms to the people that are collaborating with me. So sometimes, in fact, all the time, I'm much more conservative about the data that we are sharing around our informants than even they would like me to be. Because from my perspective on how their work can be perceived from looking at the data, I can see potential for risk that perhaps for them are less obvious, right? So maybe slightly paternalistic, I realize this, but I think for me, it's a way to try and deal with the fact that these really are sensitive materials. But the effort is absolutely there. We build it in everything that we're doing in terms of the research practices that we're using, and I'm sure we can do better. There's a big set of discussions within ethnography and more anthropological work around how to do this, which continues, which we're part of. So, we'll see whether I'm sure the practices will get better and better. Hopefully we'll get better at doing this kind of work. But for now, that's where we are. In terms of where I want to be, I think, very practically and concretely, this is going to be very domain-based answer. I don't particularly want to give you a big answer about inclusivity, partly because one of the things I've been defending in my work, I didn't get into this now, is the fact that inclusivity is not about including everybody. I think, in fact, what we need here is discrimination, and a lot of it. A lot of prioritization, a lot of thinking about whenever we're setting up any initiative, we're excluding somebody. So the question becomes, who are we actually excluding? Do we want to take accountability for that? In the case, for instance, of the work that we've been doing around cassava cultivation and how do we share data around cassava roots, which basically feeds a lot of efforts toward the marketization of cassava roots. What I would love to see is a situation where information that actually gives us access to the agroecological settings for the particular kind of cultivation is much better recognized and leads to innovation that targets those ways of thinking about agriculture, much more than, oh, well, isn't that great that we collected all that data, but now we're going to use it all to see whether we can find the next best variety that can be basically mass produced on the market and disrupt all these very annoying kind of sustainable practices on the ground. I mean, I don't particularly like that particular system of political economy for that crop for all sorts of reasons I'm not going to get into now. So I have a pretty high normative stake in thinking about how we can produce knowledge systems that give us a better handle of what real agroecology and agroecological motivated agricultural practice can be, backed by data intensive system, but not always going towards the production of the big universal product, for instance. And we can have a discussion about different domains and the kind of things I would like to see that. But I mean, in the end, it's about concrete things, right? And I know I'm talking about big things. I'm a philosopher, so I end up also talking in the abstract, but I think the goals here have got to be very concrete around the lives of the people that are affected by this innovation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the active participation. We will have now 15 minutes of coffee break, and then we will go to our workshop groups. If you forgot how to follow your color code, ask me or any other of the people responsible for the workshops. Just one last information: a recording will be published on our website, right? So just for your information, because this was also asked in the chat. Thank you so much.